At my son's farewell dinner, I was just the forgotten mother in the corner. Little did they know they were dining in a restaurant I secretly owned. They mocked me with politeness. I responded with power. That night, I didn't need revenge. I had the receipts. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching us from. We continue. I promise that this will be the best story you will hear in your life. Eleanor Green had always been a woman of few words but tremendous action. At 57, her hands told stories her lips rarely did. Calloused palms that had kneaded enough dough to feed a small army, fingertips permanently stained from years of chopping herbs and stirring sauces. These weren't the hands of someone who had chosen a culinary career. They were the hands of a woman who had no other choice. Life had dealt Eleanor a series of unexpected cards. Growing up in a small town outside of Boston, she had once dreamed of becoming an architect. She'd sketch buildings on any scrap paper she could find, imagining spaces that could transform lives. But dreams cost money, and money was something her family never had enough of. Still, she persevered through high school, earning a partial scholarship to a state college. That's where she met Michael. Charming, ambitious Michael with his plans of starting a construction business. They married young, had their first son Thomas within a year, and Daniel followed 18 months later. Eleanor put her education on hold, thinking it would be temporary. Michael's business was just taking off and someone needed to care for the boys. Just a few years, he'd promised. Then you can go back. But those few years stretched into a decade, and then came the accident. A 16-foot fall from a scaffold left Michael with a shattered spine and permanent disability. At 34, Eleanor became not just a mother and wife, but the sole provider for a family of 4. "I don't know what we're going to do," Michael had whispered from his hospital bed, tears streaming down his face. Eleanor simply squeezed his hand. "We'll figure it out," she said, though she had no idea how they would manage the mounting medical bills, mortgage payments, and everyday expenses on the meager disability checks. The answer came to her as she sat in her kitchen at 3 a.m., unable to sleep. Her grandmother's recipe book lay open on the table, a collection of handwritten cards documenting generations of family comfort food. Eleanor had learned to cook at her grandmother's side, absorbing techniques and flavors like the cast iron. Skillet absorbed seasoning with each use. The next morning, she withdrew $200 from their dwindling savings account and purchased ingredients for her grandmother's famous chicken pot pies. She made a dozen, wrapped them carefully, and set up a small table outside the elementary school where both her sons attended. "Homemade pot pies, ready to heat for dinner," she called out to the harried parents picking up their children. By the end of the afternoon, she'd sold every single one and taken orders for the next day. What began as a desperate attempt to earn grocery money grew steadily. Eleanor expanded her menu, adding hearty soups, fresh bread, and desserts that reminded people of their own childhoods. 6 months later, she rented a small food truck. A year after that, she secured a corner storefront in a working-class neighborhood and named it Green's Home Kitchen. Through it all, Michael remained her biggest cheerleader from his wheelchair, handling the books and offering business advice. The boys grew up in the back of the restaurant doing homework at empty tables and learning to help with simple tasks. "Mum, this potato peeler is broken," 8-year-old Thomas complained one evening. "No, honey. Your technique needs work," Eleanor demonstrated with patient hands. "See? Smooth and steady." She worked 16-hour days, her feet swollen and back aching, but never complained. This wasn't just about survival anymore. She'd discovered something profound about herself. She was good at this, not just the cooking, but the entire operation. She had an intuitive understanding of what people craved, how to balance flavors, and how to create an atmosphere that made customers feel at home. As the business stabilized, Eleanor focused increasingly on her sons' futures. Thomas showed an aptitude for mathematics and science, while Daniel excelled in debate and writing. She was determined they would have the education she had sacrificed. "You boys are going to college," she would say as they helped her close the restaurant. "You're going to have choices I never had." She set aside money each month, cutting corners, in their modest home to ensure the college funds grew. When Thomas expressed interest in engineering programs at prestigious universities, Eleanor took on catering jobs on her days off to afford the application fees and campus visits. "You don't have to do this, Mum," Thomas said when he found her, asleep at the kitchen table surrounded by catering menus at 2 a.m. "Yes, I do," she replied simply. "This is what parents do." When Thomas was accepted to MIT with a partial scholarship, Eleanor cried for the first time in years. She made up the difference in tuition without hesitation, proud that her firstborn would become an engineer. 2 years later, Daniel earned a spot at Georgetown University to study political science. The restaurant thrived under Eleanor's careful management. She had a gift for hiring the right people, often giving chances to those others wouldn't. Single mothers, reformed ex-convicts, immigrants struggling with English, Eleanor saw potential where others saw problems. "Mrs. Green gave me my first real chance," Maria, a Mexican immigrant who became Eleanor's assistant manager, often said. "She taught me everything I know about running a business." As the boys progressed through college, Eleanor noticed subtle changes in their visits home. Thomas began dating Vanessa, the daughter of a biotechnology executive. Daniel formed a relationship with Sophia, whose father was a prominent attorney. In Washington, D.C., the first Thanksgiving after Thomas graduated, he brought Vanessa home. Eleanor spent days preparing, wanting to impress her son's girlfriend with a traditional feast. She used her finest recipes, the ones customers begged her to put on the regular menu. "This stuffing is so interesting," Vanessa said, picking at her food. "Is that store-bought bread?" "No, I baked it fresh this morning," Eleanor replied, noticing how Thomas winced slightly. "Mom makes everything from scratch," he explained, though his tone carried an apologetic note that Eleanor had never heard before. That evening, she overheard Thomas and Vanessa talking in the guest room. "Your Mom is sweet, but don't you think this house is a bit cramped?" Vanessa whispered. "We can't all grow up in mansions," Thomas replied defensively, but then added, "But yeah, I know what you mean. It's not what you're used to." Eleanor stepped away from the door, a weight settling in her chest. For the first time, she wondered if her sacrifices had created a gulf she hadn't anticipated, one that might only widen with time. Despite the subtle changes, Eleanor remained fiercely proud of her sons. They were becoming successful young men with bright futures. If they sometimes seemed embarrassed by her working-class mannerisms or the modest home where they'd grown up, she told herself it was a small price to pay for their achievements. What she couldn't know then was how quickly that embarrassment would transform into something more painful, or how the coming years would test not just her resilience but her very sense of self-worth. The graduations came and went with polite smiles and carefully orchestrated photographs. Eleanor beamed with pride as first Thomas and then Daniel walked across their respective stages, collecting diplomas that represented everything she had worked for. She sat in audiences filled with parents who had arrived in luxury cars and designer clothes, while she wore her best dress, purchased on sale and carefully maintained for special occasions. "You must be so proud," another mother said to Eleanor, at Thomas's graduation reception. "More than words can say," Eleanor replied, watching Thomas across the room as he introduced Vanessa to his professors. She noticed how he scanned the crowd nervously whenever she approached his circle of friends. Within a year of graduation, both sons had secured impressive positions, Thomas at a cutting-edge engineering firm in Boston and Daniel at a political consultancy in Washington, D.C. Their transformation accelerated with their first paychecks. New wardrobes, sleek apartments, sophisticated hobbies. They were becoming different people, inhabitants of a world Eleanor had given them access to, but could never fully enter herself. The wedding invitations arrived within months of each other. Thomas and Vanessa planned a lavish ceremony at her parents' country club outside Boston. Daniel and Sophia chose a historic Georgetown mansion for their venue. Eleanor's input was neither sought nor welcomed in the planning process. "Mom, don't worry about contributing financially," Thomas told her when she asked about wedding expenses. "Vanessa's parents are handling everything." What Thomas didn't say, but Eleanor understood perfectly, was that her money wasn't the right kind of money. It smelled of fryer oil and came in small, hard-earned increments, not in the clean, impressive sums that flowed from investment portfolios and executive bonuses. The first significant wound came during Thomas's wedding planning. Eleanor had offered to cater part of the rehearsal dinner, a hired suggestion met with horror by Vanessa and uncomfortable silence from Thomas. "That's so sweet, Eleanor," Vanessa finally said, her voice dripping with condescension, "but we've already contracted with Chef Laurent. He trained in Paris, you know." Later that night, Eleanor overheard Thomas on the phone with his fiancée. I know, but what was I supposed to say? She meant well. Yes, I understand it would have been embarrassing. I'll talk to her." The talk came the next day, framed as concern for her well-being. "Mom, we don't want you working during the wedding festivities. You should enjoy yourself as the mother of the groom." Eleanor nodded, swallowing the truth. Her food, the food that had put her sons through college, wasn't good enough for their new lives. At Thomas's wedding, Eleanor found herself seated at a table far from the main party with distant relatives of Vanessa's family, who had no idea who she was. Michael, still in his wheelchair but dressed in his finest suit, squeezed her hand under the table. "They'll remember where they came from eventually," he whispered, but his eyes held doubt. Daniel's wedding 3 months later brought similar slights. Sophia's mother, Vivian, took Eleanor shopping for an appropriate mother-of-the-groom dress, rejecting Eleanor's initial selections. No, that's much too bright. We're going for understated elegance," Vivian insisted, steering Eleanor toward muted tones that would blend into the background. "And perhaps we should do something about your hair. My stylist could fit you in." Eleanor submitted to the makeover, watching in the salon mirror as her practical bob was transformed into something more sophisticated. The woman staring back at her was a stranger. "Much better," Sophia declared when she saw the results. "Now you look the part." The part. As if motherhood were a role she was auditioning for, rather than the core of her identity for the past 30 years. After the weddings, the visits became increasingly infrequent and uncomfortable. When the boys did come home, they arrived with lists of recommendations. "Mom, you really should update this kitchen," Daniel suggested during a rare visit. "What's wrong with it?" Eleanor asked, looking around at the functional space where she had prepared thousands of family meals. "It's just so dated. Granite countertops would really increase your home value." Eleanor didn't point out that she had no intention of selling the home where she had raised her family, or that granite countertops wouldn't pay for themselves with her modest retirement savings. The birth of Thomas and Vanessa's son, Ethan, should have brought the family closer. Instead, it created new opportunities for exclusion. Eleanor was allowed to visit the baby, but always under supervision. Her natural instincts to comfort her crying grandson were politely but firmly redirected. "We're using the Erickson method," Vanessa explained, taking Ethan from Eleanor's arms. "No picking up at the first cry. It builds independence." When Eleanor brought a handmade quilt for the baby, she later discovered it had been relegated to a closet, replaced by designer bedding that matched the nursery's carefully curated aesthetic. The final straw came when she prepared her grandmother's special chicken soup recipe when Ethan had his first cold. "Oh, we can't give him that," Vanessa said, eyeing the container suspiciously. "Too much sodium. And is that actual butter? We're only using plant-based fats." The soup, the same nourishing recipe that had sustained Thomas through countless childhood illnesses, was dumped down the drain while Eleanor watched in silence. Michael's health began to deteriorate just as the emotional distance with their sons widened into a chasm. Frequent hospital visits became the new normal, draining both their energy and finances. Eleanor cut back her hours at the restaurant, trusting her staff to maintain operations while she cared for her husband. During one particularly difficult hospital stay, she called both sons, hoping they might visit their father. Thomas cited an unmovable work commitment. Daniel promised to come but cancelled at the last minute due to a crucial networking event. "It's fine," Michael told her, though the disappointment in his eyes said otherwise. "They're building their careers." After Michael returned home, Eleanor received an unexpected call from her restaurant's head chef. Mrs. Green, we have a situation. That food critic from the Boston Globe showed up unannounced. I'm not sure we made a good impression. The review, published the following week, was scathing. Green's home kitchen has lost its way, the critic wrote. Once a reliable neighborhood establishment, it now serves outdated comfort food with little attention to contemporary tastes or techniques. Eleanor read the review with her morning coffee, recognizing the truth in the criticism. She had been so focused on Michael's health and her troubled relationship with her sons that she had neglected the business that defined her. The restaurant had stagnated while the culinary world moved forward. That evening, as she sat beside Michael's bed watching him sleep, a realization crystallized within her. She had spent decades building things for others, a business to support her family, an education for her sons, a legacy they could be proud of. Yet somewhere along the way, her own identity had become a footnote in the story, an embarrassing detail her children wished to minimize. Things need to change, she whispered to herself, not yet knowing how profoundly true those words would prove to be. The opportunity arrived in the form of a real estate flyer left on her desk by Maria, her assistant manager. Thought you might be interested, Maria had scribbled on a post-it. Note, the owner is desperate to sell. The property was an upscale restaurant in Boston's Back Bay neighborhood, the kind of establishment where Thomas and Vanessa might dine with colleagues or where Daniel would entertain political connections. The once popular venue had faltered under mismanagement, its reputation tarnishing despite the prime location. Eleanor studied the listing, something stirring within her that she hadn't felt in years. Not just determination, she had that in abundance, but ambition, not for status or recognition, but for the chance to prove something to herself. This is crazy, she told Michael that night. We can't afford this. He studied her face for a long moment, then smiled. Show me the numbers. The numbers, as it turned out, weren't as impossible as Eleanor initially thought. Decades of disciplined saving and Michael's insistence on maintaining a diverse investment portfolio had built a substantial nest egg. The struggling restaurant in Back Bay was undervalued due to its recent failures and the owner's eagerness to unload the property. We'd be risking a lot, Eleanor said, as she and Michael reviewed their finances. What's the alternative? Watch? Our retirement funds slowly dwindle while our sons pretend we don't exist. Michael's voice carried an edge she rarely heard. You've spent your life making other people's dreams come true. Maybe it's time for yours. Eleanor signed the purchase agreement 3 weeks later, a decision she kept entirely to herself. Neither Thomas nor Daniel called frequently enough to notice her distraction or the long hours she spent away from home. When they did call, their conversations remained superficial, brief updates about work achievements or, in Thomas's case, Ethan's latest developmental milestones. He's starting to recognize colors, Thomas reported proudly during one of their monthly phone calls. Vanessa's been using flashcards with him since he was 3 months old. That's wonderful, Eleanor replied, not mentioning that Thomas himself hadn't learned colors until he was nearly 3 and had turned out just fine without educational flashcards. The restaurant, formerly known as Aquitaine, had good bones but needed a complete reimagining. Eleanor hired a consultant to help with the concept, but the vision was entirely hers. A sophisticated farm-to-table establishment that honored traditional techniques while embracing contemporary sensibilities. She would name it Foundations, because everything meaningful is built on something that came before, she explained to Maria, who had agreed to help oversee Green's home kitchen while Eleanor focused on the new venture. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt truly alive. She interviewed chefs, tasting their creations with a discerning palate that surprised even herself. She worked with designers to transform the space, insisting on details that reflected her personal aesthetic. Refined but unpretentious, elegant but welcoming. Mrs. Green, are you sure about these chairs? The interior designer asked, pointing to Eleanor's selection. They're significantly more expensive than the alternatives. People notice comfort before they notice decor, Eleanor replied firmly. I want them to settle in, not be counting the minutes until they can leave. She threw herself into learning about wine pairings, sustainable sourcing, and the economics of fine dining. At night, she studied reviews of Boston's top restaurants, identifying weaknesses she could exploit and strengths she could emulate. Michael helped from home, analyzing financial projections and suggesting operational efficiencies. "You're a natural at this," he told her one evening as they reviewed the business plan. "You always have been." The statement caught her off guard. At what? Creating experiences, making people feel something. That's what your food has always done, and that's what this restaurant will do on a different scale. His words lingered with her as the project progressed. She was creating an experience, one that her sons and their wives would respect without knowing it came from her. 6 months of intensive work transformed Aquitaine into foundations. The renovation stayed on budget thanks to Eleanor's careful management and her willingness to handle certain aspects herself. She personally selected every plate, glass, and piece of silverware. She tested each recipe multiple times, providing detailed feedback to the head chef she'd hired from a well-regarded restaurant in Providence. "More acid in the sauce," she would suggest, "and the protein needs 30 seconds less on the heat." The chef, initially skeptical of taking direction from someone he viewed as a simple comfort food cook, quickly learned to respect Eleanor's palate and instincts. "Where did you train?" he asked her one day after she had corrected his beurre blanc technique. "My grandmother's kitchen, then my own," she replied simply. "And I've been feeding people for profit since you were in elementary school." 2 weeks before the opening, tragedy struck. Michael's condition worsened suddenly, resulting in another hospitalization. The doctors were grave. "His systems are beginning to fail," the specialist explained gently. "You should prepare for difficult decisions ahead." Eleanor called her sons immediately. To her surprise, both dropped everything and flew home within 24 hours. They arrived at the hospital together, looking polished and important even in their distress. "How bad is it?" Thomas asked, his voice breaking. "Slightly. He's fighting," Eleanor replied, exhausted from a night spent in the uncomfortable hospital chair. But they're not optimistic. For the first time in years, she saw genuine emotion in her sons' faces, fear, regret, and something that looked almost like shame. They stayed for 3 days, taking turns sitting with their father, while Eleanor shuttled between the hospital and the restaurant, where final preparations couldn't wait despite her personal crisis. On the 4th day, Michael stabilized. The immediate danger passed, though the doctors made it clear that this was likely the beginning of a final decline. As the crisis ebbed, Eleanor noticed her sons' attention shifting back to their external lives. Phone calls from their offices became more frequent. Conversations about when they needed to return home began to surface. "We can come back if anything changes," Daniel assured her as they prepared to leave. "Just give us a few hours' notice." Eleanor nodded, knowing what went unsaid. Their lives elsewhere had reclaimed priority now that the immediate emergency had passed. She didn't blame them, not really. They had careers, responsibilities, families of their own. What hurt was the unspoken relief she sensed in them, the eagerness to escape the sterile hospital corridors and their father's weakened state. After they left, a new determination took hold in Eleanor. The restaurant would open on schedule. Michael was stable enough to return home with visiting nurses, and Eleanor refused to delay the one project that was truly hers. "You're sure?" Maria asked, when Eleanor confirmed the opening date. "No one would blame you for postponing." "Life doesn't pause for personal problems," Eleanor replied. "The reservations are booked, the staff is ready. We open next Friday." The final week was a blur of activity. Eleanor functioned on minimal sleep, dividing her time between Michael's care and putting the finishing touches on foundations. The head chef worried about her stamina, but she never faltered. "Mrs. Green, you need to rest," he insisted when he found her personally polishing glassware at midnight before the opening. "I'll rest when we've proven ourselves," she replied, holding a wineglass up to the light to check for smudges. Opening night exceeded even Eleanor's cautious expectations. The restaurant was fully booked with a mixture of curious locals, food critics, and industry insiders. She positioned herself discreetly near the kitchen, observing without being observed, taking mental notes on everything from the pace of service to the customers' reactions to each dish. The reviews began appearing online the very next day, with formal write-ups following in the subsequent weeks. "Foundations represents the best of Boston dining," wrote the same critic who had panned Green's home kitchen months earlier. "Sophisticated without pretension, innovative while respecting culinary traditions." Reservations became increasingly difficult to secure. A month after opening, the wait list stretched to 3 weeks. Eleanor maintained her anonymity, introducing herself to inquiring customers simply as the manager when necessary. The executive chef became the public face of the restaurant, a role he embraced while privately acknowledging Eleanor as the guiding force behind their success. Michael's condition stabilized enough for him to visit Foundations once, arriving after hours when the dining room was empty. Eleanor gave him a tour in his wheelchair, watching his eyes fill with tears as he took in what she had created. "This is extraordinary," he whispered, squeezing her hand. "I always knew you were capable of greatness." 2 months later, Michael's health took another downturn. This time the decline was steady and inexorable. Eleanor hired full-time home care, enabling her to maintain her involvement with both restaurants while spending evenings at his side. During this period, her relationship with her sons deteriorated further. Their visits became perfunctory, scheduled with obvious reluctance. Eleanor sensed they were uncomfortable with their father's diminished state and perhaps even more uncomfortable with her stoic resilience in the face of it. "You don't have to handle everything alone," Thomas told her during one visit, though his tone suggested obligation rather than genuine concern. "I'm not alone," Eleanor replied. "I have excellent help." What she didn't say was that her help, the nurses, the restaurant staff, her loyal employees at Green's home kitchen, had become more reliable and supportive than her own children. The situation reached a breaking point when Vanessa suggested with thinly veiled impatience that perhaps Michael would be better off in a facility. "We know an excellent place in Vermont," she said. "Very exclusive, beautiful grounds. They specialize in end-of-life care." The suggestion, made during a rare dinner at Thomas and Vanessa's immaculate suburban home, hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. "My husband will remain in the home we built together," Eleanor replied, her voice quiet but firm. "For as long as possible." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Ethan dropping a toy in another room. Thomas and Vanessa exchanged a look that Eleanor had seen many times before, the look that said, "She doesn't understand how things work in our world." But Eleanor understood perfectly. She understood that her sons and their wives viewed her choices through a lens of embarrassment rather than respect. She understood that they saw her devotion to Michael as somehow quaint or old-fashioned rather than as the fulfillment of a promise made decades ago. Most painfully, she understood that they were waiting, not for Michael to recover, which was impossible, but for this chapter to close so they could return to their carefully curated lives with the messy reality of illness and aging safely out of sight. What they didn't understand was that Eleanor Green was no longer the woman who would silently accept their judgment. Foundations had changed her in ways that went beyond business success. It had reminded her of her own worth, independent of her identity as a mother or wife. And soon, very soon, her sons would understand this too. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, its tone so formal that Eleanor might not have recognized it as coming from her own son, if not for the signature. "Dear Mom," Daniel had written, "I wanted to inform you that I've accepted a position with Senator Harrison's foreign policy team. This represents a significant career advancement, but will require relocation to London for at least 2 years. We're having a small farewell dinner. 4 close friends and colleagues next Friday at 7 p.m. We understand if you're unable to attend given Dad's condition, but wanted to extend the invitation nonetheless. Best, Daniel." Eleanor read the message twice, noting what wasn't said as much as what was. No mention of helping with Michael's care during Daniel's absence. No suggestion that he might visit before leaving the country for years. No hint of regret about the timing of this career move. She typed a brief, polite response, congratulating him on the opportunity and confirming that Michael's condition made it impossible for her to attend. She didn't mention that Friday evenings were when Foundations was at its busiest, or that she hadn't missed personally overseeing service since the restaurant opened. It was Maria who brought the crucial information to her attention 2 days later. "Mrs. Green, you might want to see this," she said, showing Eleanor a reservation in the system. "Your son Daniel has booked a table for 12 people next Friday. The note says it's a farewell dinner." Eleanor stared at the screen, a complex mixture of emotions washing over her. Of all the restaurants in Boston, Daniel had chosen Foundations for his important event, without having any idea of her connection to it. The irony was almost too perfect. "Did you speak with him directly?" she asked Maria. "No, the reservation came through the online system. Should I call to confirm?" Eleanor considered the question carefully. "No, let's handle it like any other booking, but I'd like you to ensure they get the private dining room, and I'll oversee the service personally." For the next week, Eleanor threw herself into preparations. She worked with the executive chef to create a special tasting menu, selected the finest wines from the cellar, and ensured every detail would be impeccable. This wasn't about revenge. It was about finally being seen for who she truly was. Michael noticed her distraction during their evening hours together. "What's going on in that remarkable mind of yours?" he asked, his voice weaker but his eyes still sharp. She told him about Daniel's reservation and her decision not to reveal her ownership in advance. "Are you sure that's wise?" Michael questioned gently. "It might create an uncomfortable scene." "Probably." "Not wise," Eleanor admitted, "but necessary. They need to see me. Really see me before Daniel leaves for 2 years. Michael reached for her hand. "Then, make it count." Friday arrived with unseasonable warmth for October in Boston. Eleanor spent the morning with Michael, then headed to Foundations early to oversee final preparations. She chose her outfit carefully, a tailored black dress that the restaurant's sommelier had once described as intimidatingly elegant. Her hair, now more silver than brown, was styled in a sophisticated updo that Vanessa herself might approve. At precisely 6:45 p.m., Daniel's party began to arrive. Through the two-way mirror in her office, Eleanor watched as her younger son entered with Sophia, both immaculately dressed and moving with the easy confidence of people accustomed to being admired. They were followed by Thomas and Vanessa, who had apparently arranged childcare for Ethan. The remaining guests were couples in their 30s and 40s, all exuding the polished professionalism that characterized her son's social circles. Eleanor waited until the entire party was seated and had ordered their first round of drinks before making her entrance. She paused at the door of the private dining room, took a deep breath and stepped inside. The conversation continued for several seconds before Daniel noticed her standing there. When he did, his expression shifted from confusion to embarrassment to something like horror. "Mom, what are you doing here?" he asked, rising halfway from his chair. Every head at the table turned. Thomas knocked over his water glass. "Good evening," Eleanor said, her voice steady and professional. "Welcome to Foundations. I wanted to personally ensure that everything is to your satisfaction this evening." Silence descended on the room. As understanding dawned in her son's eyes, it was Sophia who recovered first. "Eleanor, what a lovely surprise. Do you work here?" Her tone suggested she was hoping for a simple explanation. Perhaps Eleanor had taken a part-time position as a hostess or server. "Not exactly," Eleanor replied with a small smile. "I own Foundations." The statement hung in the air like a revelation. Thomas's mouth actually fell open. "That's impossible," Vanessa blurted out. "This is one of the most exclusive restaurants in Boston." "Yes, it is," Eleanor agreed pleasantly. "We're booked solid for the next 6 weeks, and we've received excellent reviews from every major publication in New England. The Boston Globe called our dessert program revolutionary." Daniel found his voice at last. "How long have you... When did this happen?" "I purchased the property about a year ago when it was still Aquitaine. We renovated, rebranded, and opened 6 months later." Eleanor maintained her professional demeanor. "Now, I've worked with our executive chef to prepare a special tasting menu for your farewell dinner, unless you'd prefer to order à la carte." The piped, stunned silence continued until one of Daniel's colleagues, unaware of the family dynamics at play, spoke up. "The tasting menu sounds wonderful. I've been trying to get a reservation here for months." Eleanor nodded graciously. "Excellent. I'll have our sommelier bring the wine pairings we've selected, but please let me know if you have any preferences." As she turned to leave, Thomas rose from his seat. "Mom, wait, can we talk to you for a moment? Privately?" Eleanor glanced at the other guests, who were now watching the interaction with unconcealed interest. "Of course. There's a small office just down the hall." In the privacy of her office, a space that reflected the same refined aesthetic as the restaurant itself, her sons confronted her. "Why didn't you tell us about this?" Thomas demanded, his tone accusatory. "Would you have believed me if I had?" Eleanor countered. "Or would you have assumed I was exaggerating the way you do with most of my accomplishments?" Daniel paced the small room. "This doesn't make sense. How could you possibly manage this while taking care of Dad? And where did the money come from? Your father and I made sound investments throughout our marriage. As for managing everything, I've been running businesses while caring for others. My entire adult life, this is nothing new." Thomas ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "But this isn't like Green's home kitchen. This is what?" Eleanor pressed. "Too sophisticated? Too successful? Too impressive? To have come from your mother." Her words landed with precision. Both sons had the grace to look ashamed. "We never meant to make you feel," Daniel began. "Invisible," Eleanor suggested, "like an embarrassment, like someone to be managed rather than respected." Thomas sank into a chair. "We've been terrible, haven't we?" "Not terrible," Eleanor said, her voice softening slightly. "Just blind. You built new lives and decided I couldn't possibly fit into them without ever giving me the chance to try." Daniel looked as though he might cry. "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything right now," Eleanor told him. "You have guests waiting, and this is your farewell dinner. Go enjoy it. We can talk another time." "But Dad," Thomas started. "Your father knows all about foundations. He visited once when he was feeling stronger. He's incredibly proud." She moved toward the door. "Now shall we return to your party? I promise the food is excellent." The remainder of the evening unfolded with a strange mixture of tension and revelation. Eleanor supervised the service personally, watching as her sons alternated between enjoying the exceptional meal and stealing glances at her with new eyes. Their guests, oblivious to the family drama, raved about each course and the perfectly paired wines. As dessert was served, a deconstructed apple tart that paid homage to Eleanor's grandmother's recipe while elevating it to fine dining status, Daniel approached where she stood near the server's station. "This is incredible, Mom," he said quietly. "Not just the food, all of it. What you've built here." Eleanor nodded her acknowledgement. "Thank you." "I wish—" he hesitated. "I wish I'd known. Before booking the reservation, I mean. Would you have chosen another restaurant if you had?" The question caught him off guard. I don't know." "That's honest, at least," Eleanor said with a small smile. "Enjoy the rest of your evening, Daniel. And congratulations on the London position. Your father and I are very proud of you." As the party eventually prepared to leave, Thomas approached her next, Vanessa hovering uncertainly a few steps behind. "We'd like to bring Ethan here," he said. "Next weekend, maybe, if you're not too busy." Eleanor studied her older son's face, noting the genuine regret in his eyes. "Sunday brunch would be perfect. We have a lovely children's menu, though Ethan might be too young to appreciate it." "It's not about the food," Thomas said. "Well, not entirely. It's about time together as a family." Eleanor felt something tight within her chest begin to loosen. "Sunday at 11, then. I'll reserve the corner table by the windows. The light there is beautiful in the morning." After the dinner party had departed, with significantly more warmth and respect in the goodbyes than had been present in the greetings, Eleanor returned to her office. She sent a quick text to Michael's night nurse confirming all was well at home, then allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The evening had unfolded differently than she had imagined. She had expected satisfaction in the reveal, perhaps even a touch of vindication. What she hadn't anticipated was the sense of unburdening, as if a weight she had carried for years had finally been set down. Her phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. "I'm sorry for everything. Can I come see you and Dad tomorrow before I leave? There's a lot I need to say." She typed back a simple, "Yes, come for lunch." The following months brought gradual but meaningful changes. Thomas and Vanessa began bringing Ethan for regular visits, not just to Foundations, but to the family home as well. The boy took an immediate liking to the kitchen, where Eleanor taught him to roll cookie dough with the same patience she had once shown his father. "Grandma, can I stir?" became his favorite question, and Eleanor always found a way to let him help, regardless of what she was preparing. Vanessa, observing these interactions, slowly let go of her rigid parenting rules. "He seems happier when he's with you," she admitted one afternoon, "more like a child and less like a project." Daniel called weekly from London, his conversations with Eleanor evolving from dutiful check-ins to genuine exchanges. He asked her advice about restaurants he visited, sharing photos and seeking her professional opinion on different cuisines and techniques. "The chef here does something with the sauce. That reminds me of your method," he would say, "but yours was better." As Michael's condition continued its slow decline, both sons arranged their schedules to be present more often. They sat with their father, finally listening to his stories. With the attention they deserved, they took turns relieving Eleanor, insisting she take time for herself or for the restaurants. "We should have been doing this all along," Thomas said one evening as he arrived to spend the night, so Eleanor could oversee service at Foundations. "You're doing it now," she replied simply. "That's what matters." 6 months after the revelatory dinner, Eleanor made another significant decision. She invited both families, Thomas, Vanessa, and Ethan, along with Daniel and Sophia, who was visiting from London, to Green's home kitchen for Sunday dinner. "But we could go to Foundations," Vanessa suggested, confusion evident in her voice. "Isn't that more special?" "Foundations is where I work," Eleanor explained. "Green's is where our family began. I thought it was time to reconnect with those roots." The meal she prepared was intentionally reminiscent of the comfort food that had sustained them through leaner years: pot roast with root vegetables, fresh bread, and her grandmother's apple pie for dessert. As they gathered around the table, the same worn oak table where her sons had done their homework decades earlier, Eleanor felt the circle of their family story beginning to close. "I'd like to propose a toast," Daniel said, raising his glass, "to Mom, the most remarkable entrepreneur, chef, and mother I know. I'm sorry it took us so long to see you clearly." Thomas added his own glass to the toast. "And to Dad, who always saw Mum's greatness, even when we were too blind to notice." Eleanor raised her glass in acknowledgement, her eyes meeting Michael's across the table. Though weakened by illness, his gaze held the same admiration and partnership it had for nearly 40 years. Later that evening, as the families prepared to leave, Ethan tugged on Eleanor's sleeve. "Grandma, can you teach me to make pie next?" "Time?" he asked, his eyes serious. "Of course, sweetheart," she promised. "Next Sunday you and I will make a pie together." As she watched them drive away, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The path had been neither straight nor easy, but perhaps that was the nature of family, a constant process of separation and reunion, of losing and finding one another across the changing landscapes of life. Foundations had given her sons a new way to see her, but the true foundation, the essential connection between them, had been there all along, waiting to be recognized and rebuilt. Not with grand gestures or perfect understanding, but with small moments of truth, acceptance, and the simple act of breaking bread together at the same table. Eleanor returned to the kitchen to find Michael waiting, his wheelchair positioned near the window where he could watch the sunset. "They're coming back to us," he said softly. Eleanor nodded, beginning to clear the dishes with practiced hands. "They're finding their way home." And in that moment, surrounded by the lingering warmth of family and food, Eleanor Green knew that the greatest dish she had ever created wasn't found on any menu. It was the space she had built for truth, reconciliation, and the complicated, imperfect love that bound them all together. Dear listeners, we hope Eleanor's journey of resilience and recognition has touched your hearts. For more emotionally powerful stories like this one that explore family dynamics, personal growth and unexpected triumphs, we've prepared a special playlist you can find by clicking to the left. If this story of a mother's quiet strength and ultimate vindication moved you, please subscribe to our channel and like this video. Every day we bring you authentic narratives that capture the complexity of human relationships and the courage it takes to stand in your truth. Don't miss our upcoming content. Each story is crafted with the same attention to emotional depth and character development. We look forward to reading your thoughts and experiences in the comments below.